All right, awesome. All right, so it's great to see everybody for another week of Tanya, your weekly dose to give you meaning and purpose in life. We had a most fascinating discussion about who remembers what we spoke about. No, we had a most fascinating discussion last week about the emotions, love and reverence, and how they might power our divine service of God. Why were we discussing emotions? Even though the chapter is about thought, speech, and action, because we were saying that the emotions are what power us to decide to think thoughts about God, to speak godly things, and to do godly actions. And that's why the emotions are so important. This week, though, we are going to focus on the importance of the actual thought, speech, and action. So again, last week we were discussing the motivation, the love, and the reverence that powers our actions, and we explained how important it is that it's powered by the emotions, because otherwise you may be doing it for ulterior reasons, not necessarily to connect to God. We also explained how the emotions can help power you to do the right things, which is, of course, the most important, because if you're not inspired, you're unlikely to do it. However, in this week, we are going to move on to discuss the importance of the actual thought, speech, and action. In the larger picture, we've been discussing the godly soul. And in order to explain the godly soul in its entirety, we started off discussing what is the source of the godly soul, how is it godly? That was chapter 2. Then we discussed the intellect and the emotions of the godly soul. That was chapter 3. And now in chapter 4, we're discussing what's called the garments of the soul, which is the thought, speech, and action, which are not exactly a part of the soul, but help the soul express itself in thought, speech, and action. In today's class, we are going to discuss how important these garments of the soul are, even though garments, as you might expect, are secondary because they service us, right? Just as your clothing are secondary to you, we would expect the garments of the soul are secondary to the soul. Nevertheless, we will discuss and discover the importance and the power of the garments of the soul. We are going to explore this first by asking the question, what is greater or more important? I should take away the word greater. What's more important? A Jew in the heart or a Jew in action? Assuming they would be mutually exclusive, meaning you can have someone who is totally not interested in the deed but does it. That's a Jew in action. Or you have the Jew who is maybe possibly interested in the action or not, I don't know, but regardless is a Jew in their heart and is not doing the action. Which one is more powerful or important? I'm sure you've heard the statement right now, I'm a Jew in my heart, right? That's why I think a lot of Jews have maybe heart issues. It's very hard to be a Jew in your heart. You know, it's a lot of weight over there. So what is, what's more important? Which one? Any thoughts? Or
Well,
yes.
I think you've been saying it all along through the course is actions.
Actions. Okay. Let's present it in a really extreme manner. Let us say you have a Jew who is thrown into the Soviet prison for the crime of being religious. And he's sitting there Passover night, has no matzah, and is thinking all about the importance of matzah. However, is not actually eating the matzah, okay? Because he cannot have the matzah. Conversely, you have a Jew somewhere else, let's say a free Jew somewhere in America, and robbers come in, point a gun to the person's head and say, I want you to eat matzah right now. It's the pastor Seder, I want you to eat matzah. These are maybe religious robbers. I don't know. Maybe they think if they give the guy matzah, his teeth will be glued together. He won't be able to, scream anywhere. So he eats the matzah, right? So, the question is, which one did the mitzvah, right? Obviously, only the one who ate the matzah did the mitzvah. As great as the person in prison is, only one of them did the mitzvah. So you might say, well, yes, but who is God going to reward more? Well, probably the guy in prison. Yes, I'd agree. But we have to say there is something special about doing a mitzvah, and it only happens when you do the mitzvah. Reward and punishment, that's for another day. That's for another time. But actually doing the mitzvah, right? If you didn't do the mitzvah, you didn't do the mitzvah, regardless. In
Right,
fact,
but it's your motivation for doing the mitzvah. I mean, if you're doing the mitzvah, not someone forcing you to do the mitzvah, that's a different way of doing things as well. So I think your example is not necessarily the best example to compare the two. I mean, let's say
I want to bring the extreme. And what I'm saying is, even if somebody is forced to do a mitzvah, they are still at the end of the day doing a mitzvah. The Tanya will later on discuss intention does matter. And when you have a lack of intention, how it affects the mitzvah. But at the end of the day,
right.
the actual mitzvah is only completed by doing it, even if your intention is not the holiest. Well, if you eat the matzah and don't even have a mind of doing the mitzvah, you may not fulfill the obligation. That's a different story. We're assuming you say, I'm going to eat the matzah to fulfill my obligation, but you're only doing it because you're forced to do it. Okay. Not talking about where you're doing it and thinking about something else, or you were in the dark in your house and you ate matzah thinking you're eating a cracker. According to many commentaries, that's or many halakhic codifiers, that doesn't qualify as having done the mitzvah. But assuming you knew you were doing a mitzvah, even if you weren't interested in it, one person has done the mitzvah with whatever benefits and goodies come with that, and one person has not done the mitzvah, no matter how much God appreciates him. So what I'm getting to, what the point of all this, as we're going to expound upon, is despite the soul being, so to speak, the soul itself, the godly soul with its thoughts, with its intellect and its emotions, without being expressed in its clothing, quote unquote, which is its actions, it will always be missing something. So in other words, as great as the soul is, if we do not allow the soul the expression within the garments, which should be secondary, it will be missing something. And so what comes out of this is that the garments, which are secondary to the soul, are actually in some ways can elevate the soul to a higher place than it could be naturally by itself. Right? Typically something that serves another is secondary, right? My clothing is secondary to me. But in some ways, my clothing can do things for me that I otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Okay, someone writes over here. Let's take a look at the chat. Okay, we got another vote for action. Sometimes motivation is not there, but we still do it. I think that should count, even if it's not necessarily coming from the heart. Yes, correct. The action counts even if it's not coming from the heart. Certain mitzvahs, we're not getting into this too deeply, but certain mitzvahs, you have to at least know you're doing a mitzvah for it to work. Okay, not all mitzvahs, by the way. It says if you're walking and you have a hole in your pocket and a dollar bill falls out of your pocket and a poor man finds the dollar, you've given charity. Okay, so that's an example where even if you have no idea, you don't even know you lost the dollar, you fulfill a mitzvah. Okay, but that's not all mitzvahs. Many mitzvahs require at the very least a knowledge that you're doing a mitzvah. But nevertheless, you may not be motivated at all. You may be doing it to make your parents happy or whatever it is. So this is a very interesting thing. And this is important because we have a lot of people say that, what's important is the heart, their heart's in the right place, right? As long as their heart's in the right place. The heart being in the right place is important if it leads you to doing the action. In other words, like this, even if, let's say, your soul is complete, you have the right feelings in place, you have the right thoughts in place, you're a good person inside, okay? But if you don't do the actions, you're missing something. Now, the actions, the mitzvahs that we're talking about, why would my soul be missing something if I don't do the action, right? So let's say, what are the actions? The actions are very technical, okay? So let's say matzah. Matzah has to be eaten. It's a very specific cracker. It has to be eaten on the night of the 15th of Nisan. What if I said, well, I'm a very good Jew in my heart, and I want to do the mitzvah properly. I want to feel the redemption. I'm going to eat it the morning of the Seder. I'm not going to wait till the night. I'm going to eat it during the day. And my teeth hurt a lot when I eat this matzah. It doesn't really feel good on my teeth. I'm going to get something a little softer, maybe a little laf or something, a little softer. And I'm going to eat that, and I'm going to think about the Jews leaving Egypt, and I'm going to feel the redemption. Okay? So again, this person is going to say, let me do it in a better way. Let me do the mitzvah, right? Feeling the redemption, the mitzvah, the matzah, commemorating the matzah that was on the backs of the Jews. Let me do it in a better way, right? And we know that doesn't work because that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to eat a matzah cracker on the night of Passover. You can't do it during the day. And the question is, why? If my feelings are in the right place, I'm even doing some form of action, why is the nitty-gritty so important? And the answer is, maybe you know the answer, but I'll tell you the answer, is what is the purpose of a mitzvah? Okay, if the purpose of a mitzvah is just for me to commemorate and feel the redemption of the Jews of Egypt, you might be right. That's what a mitzvah is. That's how you define a mitzvah. Or if you define a mitzvah as a good deed. So I'm doing a good thing. I'm commemorating what our parents did. Again, if you're going to translate mitzvah as a good deed or a commemoration, you might be right. The details that we have are kind of silly. But, or I should say, not the details are silly, but we can change the details. But if we're going to translate a mitzvah as the other translation, which is connection, sav savachibor, if a mitzvah is translated as connection, then the details are very important. So again, let me repeat what I said. We wanted to know what's better, the heart or the action. We obviously said if you don't do the action, then you're not doing anything. Then the question is, okay, let me do an action, but let me do it what fits with me. Let me do it in a way that fits with how I feel, right? So what's the big deal? I feel very Jewish. I'm going to do something very Jewish, but I don't want to follow the exact details that feel limiting. Let me do it in a way that allows me to connect with it. And the answer is that that's all okay if you translate mitzvah as a good deed, or you translate mitzvah as something nice, or mitzvah as a commemoration. But if mitzvah is connection to God, then as Bruce writes, we follow details because that's what God wants. Okay? So let's put it this way. Let's first go from the simple level. If I love my wife and I want to get her a gift, and I want to do it in my way, so I'm going to buy her a lawnmower. I say, look, I like lawnmowers. I think you'd like a lawnmower, right? You'd like a lawnmower, right? It's self-propelled, or I can even get her a riding lawnmower. It's $4,000. I'll be sleeping in the doghouse, right? That's it's an expression of my love, but it's not. It's what I think that she wants, but it's not what she actually wants. Don't try that at home. It won't end well. Okay, yeah, it's not. Yeah, okay. Instead, I'll buy her a dishwasher. Okay, and that'll be better, right? Or a mixer, right? A mixer. Yeah, no, that's not going to work either. No, okay. The point is that if a mitzvah is about connection to God, then we need to know what God wants, and even more than that. I'm going to take it a step further. When it comes to human beings, connection between human beings is not that hard. But connection to God is impossible. God is infinite, we're finite. A very silly example, but an example. I could love the moon, but I really have no connection to the moon, honestly. I could love the moon, I could jump jump up and down towards the moon, I could build cathedrals for the moon. The moon doesn't care. The moon is far away. Maybe if I land on the moon, whatever. It's another story, So God is infinite, and he doesn't need anything that we could give him. As much as we love him, we could do anything for him. But it could be like buying him a lawnmower, or getting him a mixer, whatever it is. It's not going to connect us to God because God is infinite, and we are finite. So how do we connect to God? The answer is, of course, God can tell us. God can tell us how we can connect to him. Now you might say, Rabbi, okay, so God can tell me what he likes, but at the end of the day, he is infinite, we're finite. How do we actually connect him through doing what he wants? He's so big, we're so small. And that we're going to get into in a moment. We're going to read in the Tanya how God has allowed himself and, so to speak, put himself into these little details. So again, God is great. God is infinite. Again, we have two problems in connecting to God. Number one is we don't know what he wants. Number two, even if we know what he wants, how does it actually connect to him? So to answer number one, we don't know what he wants. Well, now we do know what he wants. He tells us in the Torah what he wants. So that's always good. That's why, by the way, every religion starts with revelation. Without revelation, there is no religion. Why is there no religion without revelation? Because you could serve God, but you have no idea what he wants, right? So you need revelation for religion. You can believe in God without religion. That's fine. But religion means a prescribed way of connecting to this God. And that's why every religion requires revelation. You need to know what he wants. But number two, even once we know what he wants, what is the mechanism? How does the mitzvah actually connect us to God? And we're going to discuss that in today's Tanya. So let us recap what we've said. We started off discussing that the soul has clothing. Clothing is the thought, the speech, and the action. Called clothing because it's not the soul itself. They're interchangeable. That obviously shows it's not the soul itself. If you can change your actions, that means it's not part of the soul itself. What we were discussing. So what is, if that's the case, what's greater? Is action greater or is being a good person greater? Equal. Well, they're different. Each one is greater in different ways. And in a certain sense, action, thought, speech, and action is greater for the soul. Why? We said because through thought, speech, and action, the soul can actually do the deed. And the deed is the mitzvah. And the mitzvah, as we are explaining, allows us to connect to God. We ask the question, well, if I'm a Jew in my heart, and why can I connect to God with how I figure it out? I know I might, I have a kind of a good idea what God wants. Let me do things that he likes. And of course, the answer is that number one, you don't know what he wants. Number two is, as we're going to explain, even if you do know what he wants, how is it going to connect to him? And so that's what we're explaining here. Which, by the way, just to give another example, this is why mitzvahs, even if you know what God wants, it's not, you have to follow the details, just as it's important. The details, there's details in, God is very detailed. There's time, there's place, there's the details, and there's who does it as well. Mm-hmm. That's why in Judaism, right, the 613 commandments are for the Jewish people. If you're not Jewish, you don't need to do them. In fact, doing them doesn't really do much for you because they're not necessarily your avenue to connect with God. Just as there are certain mitzvahs for women, certain mitzvahs for men, everybody has their own avenues to connect with God, and the other ones are not necessary and are not ways that you need to connect to God. God says, this is how you will connect to God. These are your avenues and these are your pathways. It's very hard to be Jewish because we have a lot more commandments to do than those who are Noahites. They got only 7, but that is what it is. That's what we signed up for. So we know what God wants from us. It's in the Torah. Yes, and it's important to follow the details. That's really what I'm getting to. The details of there are so important. For example, I'm harping on this because a lot of people hate the details of the mitzvah. It's very difficult. It is difficult. Like, really, Rabbi? Like, is that so important? Like, why does it have to be, like when I say, all right, on the morning of Passover, you stop eating chametz at this time, sell your chametz before this time. And then at night, you can only eat the matzah at this time, like when you come to Chabad, it's just like, why is the Seder so late? Or, why is, there's so many things that we do that are just time-based, that are so difficult. And people want to know, does God really care about those details? Right? That's people's feeling. It's a good feeling, right? Like, does God really care about those details? What's so important is the heart. This is where it comes out, right? Does God really care about the details? What's important is the heart. What's important is that you feel it. Is there a difference if you ate the matzah 1 minute early, 1 minute late? You think God is sitting there waiting to know if you eat it 1 minute early, 1 minute late? Does he really care that much? What do you think?
I think it's up to you.
It's not. What do you mean? It's not, so if I want to eat the matzah a minute early, then it works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it?
Does it? It's up to me. If it was up to me, then I would skip the matzah altogether.
Well, I mean, it's like you said with the Rabbi, are you holy? He's like, I don't think I am.
Mm-hmm.
It's up to him, isn't it? So I would think the same thing.
Is that a phone call?
Not mine.
Not mine. Okay. But okay, so I think I've explained it now in a way that I think relates to all of us. When we sometimes look at a detail of a mitzvah, and we're like, does God really, really care that much if it's this way and not that way? Does it have to be here and there? What's important is you want to connect to God. What's important is the feeling of connection. Why are the details important? God cares about the bigger picture. The answer is God is infinite. And it is kind of crazy, but it goes like this. God is infinite. Nothing really connects to God unless he decides it is. And God decided to take his infinite self and put himself in finite details with which you can connect to him. And so unless you're following the exact finite details in which he put himself in, you are not connecting with him. Because think about it like this. If you are saying, let me connect to him in ways that I want, then you are once again connecting God in a finite way, but not in the way that he said. And therefore, no matter where your heart is, you are not doing the actions that are going to connect to him. He said, this is how you can connect to me. I am unlimited, but I put myself in finite actions and details in which you can connect with me. And only if you follow those details is it going to work. It's a hard thing to swallow, because it sounds kind of crazy. Does God really care about little details? Like I said, the example, if you eat the matzah 1 minute earlier, 1 minute later, does it really make a difference? Does God really, really care? I'm going to posit to you, put aside, does God care? Does God not care? If you eat the matzah 1 minute early, with what are you connecting to God? How are you connecting to him? And you may feel love towards him. That I'll give to you. You definitely have feelings of love towards him. Sincerity is there, but you're not actually doing the action that would connect you to him.
Well,
because it's like I say, right? There's the old saying, right? Either you're pregnant or you're not, right?
Right.
Either you're doing it or you're not doing it.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, it's like when we prepare for Shabbat, we prepare before Shabbat so that you're not working during Shabbat. It's the same thing. It's a training yourself to do what you need to do, whether you do it late.
Here we get into a whole discussion of when you're not ready to do everything. How do you do certain things? But there is a concept, for example, let's say lighting Shabbat candles. It's a mitzvah to light Shabbat candles every week. It's better though not to light them than to light them after sundown. Okay, that's an example. That's a good example. People say, well, what do you mean? I get home from work late. Well, let me light the candles. Yes, but if you look at a mitzvah as a good deed, or a mitzvah as an expression of your love to God, you are right. But if we come to understand that a mitzvah is a way to connect to God, then if we're not following the details, it may be not only not connecting to him, but it may be the antithesis of what he wants. It's a hard thing to swallow, because again, they are expressions of our love to God. That's what I'm trying to get to. Like, I'm not knocking anybody that does these things. I mean, I know many Jews who light their Shabbat candles late, and I have nothing against them. In a sense, it's beautiful. But here we're trying to educate ourselves. We're always trying to get better in life. And the point is that if we translate mitzvah as good deed, do it however you want, right? But if we are translating mitzvah as a connection to God, which we're going to explain in the Tanya text soon, then if you're not doing the details of it. Now, I also want to say, by the way, there's some details that are necessary, some details that aren't necessary. Okay, so I have to throw that out there. Don't think like it's either 100% or nothing. There are certain details you have to do totally. Certain details, though, not necessarily, right? Okay, so like, for example, you can light Shabbat candles, get that mitzvah, and not keep Shabbat, right? They're not mutually exclusive. Or you can, keep Shabbat for the first 2 hours of Shabbat and then break it later. Those 2 hours were 2 hours, right? Or anything you abstain from on Shabbat is a mitzvah, even if you're not keeping the whole thing, okay? That's what I'm saying. At this moment, but certain things, if you don't follow the details, it's nothing. For example, if you can have all the kosher matzah in the world and the shmura matzah, but if you eat it too early, a minute early, then it doesn't work. Okay. So it varies on the mitzvah.
Yeah, that's the question. Does it work?
But the point is that unless you're following the details of the specific mitzvah at that moment, the mitzvah is not going to accomplish the connection to God. Will it accomplish an expression of your love to God? I would say yes. And I would say, you're a very sincere person, but it would be almost akin to that Jew stuck in prison that cannot do the mitzvah. As much as they love God, they're not actually doing the mitzvah. So as much as you love God and the deed you're doing is a expression of your love to God, you have not actually connected to him. Rabbis make sure there's a lot of details.
So Rabbi, let's talk about that for 1 second.
Yes.
Because obviously there are interpretations.
Yes.
Okay, so it says in the Torah, do this. And then the rabbis interpret, do this as different things over the years. Or that in one way, do this meant this, and then another time, do this meant this. And it's a lot of interpretation. So when you say, if you do it the exact minute, you don't do it 5 minutes later, 8 minutes later, you do it, whatever. How much of that is then interpretation versus how much of that is really, quote, what God wants? That's always been my concern being, I have friends who have Judaism across the spectrum,
Right.
So, and everyone has their own interpretation. Some are very strict, some are very not so strict. So, right. But they are indeed interpretations. So,
all right, to answer your question, I'm sure I've touched upon in other classes. Of course, the study of Tanya assumes certain priorities and acceptances of the Orthodox traditional beliefs. However, I will digress for a moment on this because it is important. The word interpretation is interesting. Just to back up for a second, Chabad Jews just started a new study cycle of studying Rambam Maimonides, and Maimonides has a beautiful introduction explaining the oral tradition. If you ever wanted to take a look at it, you can find it on Chabad.org. Rambam's introduction. It's great. It's a good read. It's not very long. But anyways, interpretation. All right, so it goes back to the oral tradition. How much do you trust oral tradition or you don't? When God gave us the Torah, I'm going to tell you, of course, the Orthodox belief. When God gave us the Torah, given with the Torah was both a written and an oral tradition. We can see this clearly in many cases. You can look at the Torah itself. So many of the details of the mitzvahs are unclear. Just example is the mezuzah. The Torah says you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. I haven't seen anybody taking a pencil and writing anything on their actual doorpost, right? Most people I've seen have a scroll in a case, and they're hanging up there with certain details. To fill in is another great example. You should bind them as a sign upon your arm. It should be for reminder between your eyes. So as a book of instruction, the Torah is actually very bad. It's really it's not very good. It's not a great guidebook. It's done a poor job. Right. So obviously our belief is that God gave it to us with a oral tradition. The oral tradition itself is split up into multiple tiers and layers. I've discussed this in other classes. There's what's called received, derived, and legislated. Received means there are certain traditions that were received directly. Moses said, all right, fill in, this is what they look like. They're black, they're square. Jews have been doing that for thousands of generations. These are the sections that go inside of it. This is roughly where you put it. Okay. Then there's derived. Derived means along with giving the oral tradition, there were certain principles of certain principles of interpretation that were given to the sages of how to understand passages in the Torah. And then there's legislated. Legislated means it's completely, definitely not part of the original oral tradition, but for certain reasons, the rabbi said we need to legislate new rules and laws in order to, for certain reasons. Let's say just an example is muktzah on Shabbos. Muktzah on Shabbos means you can't just pick up anything on Shabbos for no reason. The rabbis did that to create more of a restful Shabbos, so you shouldn't be busy moving things around in your house. Okay, that's just one example. So it's clearly not clearly in the Torah. However, we believe that whether you are doing a biblical or a rabbinic ordinance, both of them are connecting us to God, because even the rabbis listening to the rabbinical ordinances, the Torah itself says, you shall listen and not deviate from what they tell you to the sages in your generation. So that also is connecting you to God. A good example of this, as I mention all the time, is everybody here lights a Hanukkah menorah. When you light a Hanukkah menorah, you make a blessing. Blessed is you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candle. Now, you look in the Torah, there's no commandment to light a Hanukkah candle, right? Because Hanukkah came 1,000 years. So how can we honestly come and say, God, thank you for commanding us to light the menorah? The answer is by extension of the rabbis. God said to listen to the sages. The sages commanded us to light the menorah. Therefore, by extension, we can make a bracha on the Hanukkah candles that we are fulfilling God's commandment by listening to the rabbis. Now, you could say the rabbis have debates, and how do we say, well, we're following God's word by listening to the rabbis? Again, a lengthy discussion, but put it simply, the basics of all the mitzvah, everybody agrees on. An example, mezuzah, everybody agrees what a mezuzah is. There's a debate in the rabbis, is the mezuzah upwards or is it sideways? We actually go in between, we put it on a diagonal, but just so you understand. The debates are about details, and therefore, you can, when I said that if you don't follow the details, you're not doing the mitzvah at all, I'm referring to details that all the rabbis agree on. Okay, let's put it that way, right? So everybody agrees. God says in the Torah, you have to bring, you have to eat the matzah on the night of Passover. Therefore, if you eat it before it's nightfall, you have not done the mitzvah, according to all opinions. Now, what if you have sages who argue what time is nightfall? Then you can make the argument according to one opinion, I'm fulfilling my obligation, who says nightfall's earlier. Again, it's a debate about the details. But for sure, if you eat it in the morning, everybody would agree you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah, right? Just so you understand. So the rabbis, I say, that's why I say they're not just, wow, thought we're inside, it'll be better. The rabbis are not just interpretation. There's a lot of, that's why I say it's received, derived, legislated. Received is a received direct tradition, which none of the rabbis disagree on. There are derived, which are certain principles. There are certain debates, but again, the debates are a lot of times in details. And that's why I said, you know, if you're and this is how God wanted it. He wanted it to be passed down through this method, and to understand the halacha, to understand what it is that we're supposed to do, what is it that we're not supposed to do. But for sure, if we're for sure not following the details according to anybody, we are not fulfilling our obligation. We are not fulfilling God's will. Does that answer somewhat to your question? Yes. Okay. So therefore, we want to endeavor to do God's will as best as we understand it. Okay, that's another thing, by the way. Obviously, this is not like I'm not boasting here, but I assume that I have the most knowledge about Jewish law over most of you over here, right? We're all going to try and do our. I'm just making an assumption. I'm hoping, right? Jewish law. I'm not saying other areas of life, but you know, you endeavor in each area to do God's will as best as you understand. That's really the idea, and it's really all you can do. And so each mitzvah, you know, we are always getting better in life. I think I'm sure there's mitzvahs I don't do 100% based on my knowledge of or certainly sins. You know, mitzvahs are a little easier to know what to do. Sins, I'm sure I, do certain sins because I'm not knowledgeable. In fact, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe who wrote a code of Jewish law, he said, if you don't study the laws of Shabbos every single week, you're probably doing certain things wrong. You know, it's a lifetime of work. It is a lifetime of work. I don't think any of us here on this call are expecting perfection. What we are, though, expecting is to try and be better every single day. And with that, we are always trying to look to figure out what is God's will for us. And God's will is in the details. And those are the ways we can connect to God. I hope that explains somewhat of what we've been discussing. So at this point, I think we should go inside some text. Just one final example, by the way. Email is always a great example. If you send me an email and you mess up one letter, I'll never get the email. You say, Rabbi, I sent you an email. You missed. I missed one. I wrote a B instead of an A. You know, I wrote whatever. Well, you know, the one detail makes a difference. You know. So to put this in words of mitzvahs, let's give a physical example of a mitzvah. My gosh, the grass guys. How do they know that when the Tanya class is? Let's say the mitzvah of lulav and etrog, right? Everybody knows lulav and etrog on Sukkot commemorates binding all the different Jewish people together, right? So a mitzvah lulav and etrog is not only a beautiful idea of connecting all the Jewish people together, but it is also a commandment that connects us with God. Let us read inside, okay? Talking too much. That's time we did some reading. So we're going to be in the practical Tanya. I'm going to share the screen as well for those who need it, but we're in the practical Tanya on page
67.
67, yes, page 67. Good. All right, let me click here to share. Share. Okay. All right. Up to this point, chapter 4 has clarified the importance of the outer self, the garments of thought, speech, and action in completing the inner self of intellect and emotional conviction. Merely to love God and fear Him in the heart is not enough. You need to express those feelings too by devoting your thoughts, your words, and actions to Him. Still, the devotion of your outer self could easily be seen as a mere icing on the cake. Doesn't inner devotion represent the most substantive connection to God and not the garments? Aren't they called garments for a reason, to indicate their secondary status to the core intellectual and emotional powers of the soul? While this would be a reasonable assumption, the Tanya now rejects it. So again, everything we're reading here is what I've told you outside. So he reads, now these three garments, when devoted to Torah and its mitzvahs, so again, the three garments being thought, speech, and action, although they are referred to as mere garments of the core soul, which again, garments you would assume would be secondary because they service us, they're not us as ourselves. And he explains what is the soul. The soul is composed of three levels, even though it's five, but three lower levels, the nefesh, the ruach, and the shama. Not going to delve into that right now. Nevertheless, they are of an infinitely greater level and quality than the actual nefesh, ruach, and neshama, also known as soul. So again, the garments are in some way an infinitely greater level and quality than the soul. The Tanya has made a strikingly, seemingly bizarre proposition that the clothes are more important than the person, that the outer life of the soul is vastly more significant than its inner convictions and infinitely so. And he continues, as the Zohar teaches. So now the Zohar is going to show us how God is one with his Torah and his mitzvos. So the Zohar says, the Torah and God are totally one. This, just by the way, just as an aside, remember how I've said multiple times that Tanya is also speaking to the scholar. So every statement he makes, he has to back it up with scholarly references. So don't want you to get lost in it. But okay, so he says, the Torah and God are totally one. Now, how is that the case? God is God and the Torah is something he wrote, an instruction. So first of all, I want you to understand the Torah is both the physical book we have, but there is a spiritual Torah, so to speak. It says the Torah preceded the world 2,000 years before the world was given. But anyways, let's continue. Meaning that the Torah, which is the wisdom and will of God, something that would seem to be a mere glimmer of his divine essence, is in fact completely one with God himself in all his glory. This is a radical statement, by the way, just so you understand, right? If I write a book, I'm not one with my book, right? The book is some wisdom that I've pulled out of myself. It's maybe a glimmer of myself. It's something, an extension of myself. It's not me. But so this is the question, as he says, but if the Torah and its mitzvahs are merely the wisdom and will of God, not his actual self, how could we say that he is truly one with them? So first he's going to answer how God's wisdom is one with God. So he explains, because he is simultaneously the knower, the power to know, and the known, as explained above, citing the Rambam. So we had in earlier on in the Tanya, God has the ability to be one with the knowledge, right? We explained as human beings, our knowledge and ourselves are separate, right? There is me and there's what I know. How do I know they're separate? Because the knowledge was added to me after I was me. There was me as I was me. And then I learned that how pistons in a car work. That knowledge is not me, it's additional to me. But God, the knowledge and him is one. He is one with his knowledge. Now, you may say, well, how does that actually work? So let's read inside. While it's impossible for a human being to fully understand God, God has invested himself in the Torah to the extent that he has become completely one with it. Okay, so this is a matter of belief, of course. Okay, in other words, I can't prove to you God is one with the Torah. It's a matter of belief. But nevertheless, the belief is that God can be one with his Torah. So although you would assume the Torah is just wisdom of God, it's not him himself. Nevertheless, God is one with his Torah. Now he continues. Still, the assertion seems counterintuitive. The Torah is a set of very detailed laws defining time, place, and precise contours of every single mitzvah. Failure to observe any of these minutiae will either compromise the act or disqualify it. How could all this be totally one with God, who transcends all limitations and is utterly right? Right? How are we saying details, which is finite, is one with an infinite God? So this was a question I asked earlier. I didn't answer it actually. I said two things. I said, number one, only God can tell us how to connect with him. Then I said, number two is, well, how do finite details actually connect us to God? So here he's going to explain. And while the Holy One, blessed be he, the Holy One, the blessed Holy One is called throughout the Kabbalah as Ein Sof, without an end, and his greatness cannot be fathomed, as it says in the book of Psalms, and no thought can grasp him at all, as it says in the Zohar. Similarly, his will and wisdom are depicted as non-graspable, as the verse states, his understanding no one can fathom. And it is also written, can you through searching find God, in the book of Job. And it is written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, Isaiah. So all this is to strengthen the question by based on verses. If God is infinite, how can he actually be found in the finite, right? So you told me, notice what we've told you so far is you can connect to God through mitzvah. Why? Because that's what God wants. But at the end of the day, God is infinite. How can he actually be found in finite and minute details? Don't I have to become infinite to reach him? Nevertheless, as he says, God's infinitude and other oneness is in fact perfectly consistent with the limited and detailed laws of the Torah. So let me explain for a moment. We tend to think that infinite cannot become finite. For example, the number infinity in math, right? Plus one is still infinity. It's not an infinity plus one, right? Infinite is infinite. Infinite cannot be finite. You can't chop infinite into finite details.
A mountain with no top.
Right. But God is different, because God is not just infinite. God can do anything. And that means that God can be infinite and place himself in the finite. So again, an infinite number, an infinite amount, and an infinite amount of something can never be split. Those for the mathematicians over here. Right? In other words, you cannot, there's actually no number, you can't take the number infinity and then split it into detailed numbers. Right. There is none. Like I always say, is a million closer to infinity than one? The answer is no. Not to boggle your minds. But God is infinite, so infinite that he can make himself finite. That's what makes him God. He can do everything. He can be infinite and finite. In other words, the expression of his ability to do everything is expressed in the fact that he can also make himself limited. Because if he couldn't make himself limited, then he would be limited by not being able to be limited. I'll say that again because it's crazy. If God could not make himself limited, then he would be limited by not being able to be limited. So therefore, God can limit himself and place himself in our finite world. So again, naturally, God is infinite. There's no way to connect with him. But precisely because he's infinite, he can also choose to limit himself into certain details. So let's read. To explain this, it has been taught, in the same place that you find the greatness of God, there you find his humility. What does that mean? At a literal, right? In other words, if you see the greatness, how is there humility there? Usually in the smallness, you would say, right? Mm-hmm. At the literal level, a Talmud is merely noting how scripture will sometimes place a verse that speaks of the greatness of God right next to another that speaks of his humility. But here the Tanya interprets the Talmud's teaching in a metaphysical sense as musing on God's infinitude. Usually we think of infinity as limitless expansiveness, the ability to extend in any direction without end. However, as the Kabbalist, Rabbi Meir Ibn Gabai observed, if you would say that God is only infinite and can never be expressed himself in a finite way, you would ironically be limiting him. You would be saying there is one thing which God cannot in fact do. To resolve this paradox, Rabbi Meir Ibn Gabai suggests that God has both the ability to express himself infinitely and finite if he so wishes, otherwise you diminish his perfection. Okay, so that's what I explained a moment ago. Let's continue. In this vein, the Tanya offers us a fresh reading of the Talmud's teaching. In the same place you find the greatness of God, i.e. his ability to be infinite, there you will find his humility. He can also express himself in a finite way, the finite garb of a precise mitzvah ritual. That is his true greatness. So again, the greatness of God is the fact that he can come into small things.
Yeah.
So that's what it means. In the greatness of God, you find his humility. The greatest greatness of God is that he can become finite. Now, the greatest is to be infinite. The greatest to become finite. Just an example is the greatest of people are the people who also care about individuals, right? I'm sure there's other greats. Obviously, the Rabbi was a great example of this. The Rabbi cared about the individuals, not just the organization. The greatest people are those who care about the little individuals. There's actually a story when Menachem Begin visited the Rebbe. He had a long talk with the Rebbe. I think after that he was flying to France. And the Rebbe told him, when you go to France, I want you also to talk to a certain Jew about intermarriage. Think about this here. You have the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Rebbe is telling him, when you get there, aside from all your important things, I want you to speak to one person about a specific detail. But that's greatness. Greatness is not just to care for the general, to care for the individual. And so that's the greatness of God. Not only can he be infinite, but he can be finite. So this, by the way, ties into what we've been saying this entire time. We tend to think of God not, a lot of people actually, I hear this all the time, forget about mitzvahs. Can God really, gosh, my phone is blowing up. Let me turn off my ringer. A lot of people, a lot of times say, does God really care about these little details of my life? The little things that I worry about. And actually, people tend to think, well, saying that God is great means that he doesn't care about the little details of my life. But what we're learning in Tanya today is that's actually limiting God. To actually make God even greater is to say that he cares about the details. That's the greatest of greatest. That's the greatness of God. To say God doesn't care about us, I shouldn't say. To say God doesn't care about the little details of my life would be to be saying God is great. But to say God is really great would be to be saying that he cares about me. So ironically, saying God thinks about the little details of my life is actually praising God, is actually saying how great God is. Mm-hmm. Fascinating insight. So as this pertains to the mitzvah, it's the same thing. God cares about the detail of the mitzvah. He wants to know, is Adam eating the matzah on the Seder night after nightfall? Coming back to that. He cares about you individually. No, he doesn't just care about you. He cares about you individually. Tonight, what time are you eating the matzah? Think about it. God cares about that.
Yeah, a minute too early now.
Too early. He's sad. He was hoping he would do it, a minute later. All right, so let's read it. And the Blessed Holy One has compacted his will and wisdom into 613 commandments of the Torah and their associated laws, and into the text of the Torah, prophets, and writings, as well as their commentaries and Haggadahs, Midrashim, homilies, and the sages of Blessed Mary. So God not only compacted his will and wisdom into the commandments, he also compacted himself into the Torah itself. That's why we connect to God by studying Torah as well, not just by doing a mitzvah, but studying Torah. So he says, just as a mitzvah represents the infinite will of God and in finite garb, the sacred texts and rituals of Judaism are finite expressions of the limitless wisdom of God. Why did God perform this metaphysical wonder of expressing his infinite self in finite form? So he says, this was in order that all the neshama or ruach or nefesh in your body, this was, in other words, that your soul, should be able to mentally grasp these mitzvahs and sacred texts and observe them as best as possible in action, speech, and thought, and thereby address all 10 powers of the soul described in chapter 3 in these 3 garments of speech, action, speech, and thought, becoming totally one with God. So again, why did God do this? We're asking, why did God limit himself into Torah mitzvahs? For you, so that your soul can connect to God. Because if he did not put himself in the Torah mitzvahs, there would never be a way that you could become one with God, because God is infinite and you're limited. God's greatness is that he put himself in the Torah mitzvahs and he allows us to connect with him. And therefore, even when we're doing minute details of mitzvahs, we are connected with him. And now Tanya is going to add one final layer, which is going to give kind of a parable to show us how the greatness of God can come into the Torah. And we're going to give an example of water. The Torah is compared to water in many places. The prophets compared to water. Rabbi Akiva compared it to water. Famous story, Rabbi Akiva, the water dripping in the rock. So Torah is compared to water in Talmudic teachings. Now, water is an apt example. Why? Because water, as we know, always finds the lowest place, right? It's a pain for us in Florida. Water always finds the lowest place. It comes from your roof. It'll somehow always eventually find a way to get into your house, right? Water always finds the lowest place. So as it pertains to Torah, we say, just as water will always find the lowest place, what that means, though, is that the same water that was really high is the same water that's really low. The water that's on top of the glaciers ultimately comes down into the water that's you're drinking, right?
Right.
But it's the same water. So it's the same thing as the Torah. The Torah comes from the highest of high places, God himself, but the same Torah that's up there is the same Torah that's down here. Same quality. You might say, well, it's down here. It's not on the top of the glacier. It's not up there, in heaven. It's the same thing. Let's read. He says, Tanya now cites another Talmudic teaching which sheds further light on this idea, the fusion of the infinite will and wisdom with the finite vessels of the Torah text and rituals. Therefore, the Torah has been compared by the Talmud to water, just as water has the tendency to flow from a higher level to a lower one. For those of us living in Florida, we know it already. In a similar way, the Torah has descended from its sublime setting in God's blessed will and wisdom, where the Torah and God are totally one, and no thought can grasp him at all. And from there, the Torah's journey downwards through the hidden places and steps, unaffected by step downward spiritual and not suffering any dilution or diminishment at all. So the final point where God's will is dressed in physical objects and worldly concepts. Just to explain what that means. We read the Torah here. There is a Torah studied in heaven. It says when we pass away, we go to the Garden of Eden, they study Torah too. What are souls discussing in heaven? Are they discussing about, physical flour and water? Are they discussing, not stealing? Are they discussing murder? All those things don't exist in heaven. Are they discussing physical food? No. It says that the physicality of the Torah down here is discussed in a spiritual manner in heaven. It's totally spiritual. So, but it's the same Torah. That's what we're explaining. The same Torah that's spiritual is the same Torah that's physical. It's like water that came from the glacier, came down here. Same Torah. That's what he's saying here. It came in different levels and a journey, unlike our souls, right? Remember how we explained earlier, our souls, there's a gestation period and a high and low, whatever. The Torah doesn't suffer any dilution or diminishment. It's the final point where God's will is dressed in physical objects and worldly concepts, which is the context of virtually all Torah's commandments and the laws, as well as its sacred text written in physical form, ink and parchment, and 24 books of the Torah. All this was in order that every mind should be able to grasp them, since even a simple person or child can read the Tanakh, and even the outer garments of speech and action, which are more superficial than thought, should be able to be grasped and address them in them. So what we're saying is the Torah, God did us a favor dressing it in a physical format. Think about it. Before God gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai, it says the angels said, don't give them the Torah, leave it here. What does that even mean? Do the angels, can they keep kosher? Can they commit adultery? Most of the mitzvahs, how does it apply to them? What was even the thought to leave it in heaven? The answer, of course, is that Torah exists on a spiritual level as well. And they said, let's leave it in the spiritual format. No, it was given to us in the physical format. Nevertheless, what we're saying here in Tanya is, even when the Torah is expressed in the physical format, it is still just as holy as when it was in the highest of highest spiritual formats. And that is that it is the will and wisdom, it is one with God. And therefore, we're concluding today's lesson that God has given us this blessing of the garments of the soul, the thought, the speech, and the action. And through these thought, speech, and action, we can do the details of the Torah and the mitzvahs that God gives us. And through the details of the Torah that God gives us, we can unite ourselves with the infinite God. We can do a mitzvah, which connects us with the one God. And we can also, as well, which we're going to discuss more in the next chapter, Torah study. Chapter 5 is going to discuss Torah study. We can unite with the wisdom of God, but that's for another time. And therefore, what's the final analysis? We can love God. We can have sincere feelings towards God. If we truly want to express those sincere feelings of God towards God, we shouldn't buy him a lawnmower. We should get him what he wants and connect with him in the ways that we know work. And that is the ways that he has given us through the Torah and the mitzvos, passed down to us through the generations, for many, many generations. And that is my spiel for today. And we're open for questions. Stop the recording.
Yes, a color, Rabbi.